Welcome. We're really, really glad you guys are here. It has been a labor of love compiling a report that I think is really, really telling on trends that we see happening in the anti-trafficking field. Just some housekeeping, because you can't have a webinar without it. One, this is being recorded, so you can access it later on. Once we get it cleaned up and edited, we'll have it on our website, and we'll be sending it out as a follow-up via email. We will also be emailing all of you the actual PDF report. Actually, it's a link that's on our website because we put a lot of graphs in it and illustrations to help understand all of the content. Probably everybody on this webinar can read really dense content. I need pictures. So we put pictures in to help people like me understand what we're actually trying to say. So it's a big file, so it's just a link. And then we'll send that, and it'll also be available on our website. And then again, webinar. If you have any questions, any comments, please put them in the chat box. We will address them at the end of the presentation. We love, love, love hearing from you guys. So please say, just feel free to participate. Give us a clap hands if you like what we're seeing, because I certainly love that affirmation. And then just to give you kind of some idea of what we did here is when the State Department sends requests for information to be included in the tip report, they send a long list of questions. NTSA decided to address specifically 3 questions, which Annie's going to go into. So we did under the protection section, and it's questions number 16, 17, and 18. So if you're signing in late and Annie's like, we're going to start with question number 16, you did not miss the beginning of the webinar. We only addressed 3 questions within the State Department's request for information. So with that, I do want to introduce my colleague, Annie. Annie has taken a huge lead in developing a big part of our accreditation program. She's drafted much of our commentary, really helped us to strengthen and enhance our essential standards for those serving survivors of trafficking, but also has, since she graduated with her master's degree in December, taken on the role of partnerships with our government officials to help make sure that we are raising and elevating the voices of survivor services out there at the federal level. So Annie, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just to echo what Melissa was saying, we are really so excited to share with you all of our findings from our national survey conducted for the purposes of this tip report. So let us just pull up our PowerPoint. Thank you so much, Zach. And we can go to the first slide. So in order to answer key questions regarding protection for survivors as dictated by the TIP office, NTSA conducted a national survey of service providers, including both residential and non-residential programs. We are so thrilled to have had 70 organizations across 35 states participate in this survey. And these organizations really represent diversity and commonalities in the anti-trafficking field, serving various demographics through specific program models and services. This diversity was demonstrated through the finding that 26% of the programs have 6 to 10 staff members and 20% have 30 plus staff members, making it evident that the anti-trafficking service providers are not uniform in makeup and service scale. Additionally, we found that 30% of the organizations have a current capacity of 4 to 6 beds for survivors, and 19% have a capacity of 19 plus bed for survivors. These variations in program makeup are significant in highlighting how service providers vary, but can each provide different survivors with their desired program environment. So through NTSA's survey of providers, we were able to better understand the state of service provision for survivors in this country, including through identifying the most common services provided, the various gaps in services, and the ways that providers believe the field can be improved overall. So the first question out of the 3 that we sought to answer through the survey was protection question number 16, which addresses who provides services to survivors, what services are provided, and how service access varies among different demographics. demographics of survivors. So the organizations that participated in the survey were asked to identify all of the services that their organization provided out of a list of the most common survivor services. Of the 70 organizations, the average number of types of services offered was 9, with the highest number of services offered among the organizations being 14 and the least being 1 service offered. The most common service offered by the organizations were food, with 67 out of the 70 organizations offering this service, shelter with 61 of the organizations, mental health care services with 60 of the organizations, and job training with 57 of the organizations providing this service. So the commonality of these services suggests a recognition among service providers that these services are really essential to meeting the basic needs of survivors during their recovery, while also ensuring a stable future through things like employment training. And also important to note, the least common services offered by the organizations were language interpretation, with only 16 of the 70 organizations offering this service, and family counseling, with around 30 of the organizations offering this service. This really suggests that service providers may need to focus on improving access to services for non-English speaking survivors, as well as to integrate families whenever possible into the recovery of their clients.
And just to add to what Annie is sharing about that, as many of us in the anti-trafficking field understand, most survivors come from very, very toxic family backgrounds. And so trying to figure out a way to either create healthy dynamics or healthy boundaries with family counseling is really important to the overall long-term recovery for survivors. The other piece that I really want to highlight here is that only 34 out of the 70 agencies are actually able to provide legal services. This is really, I think, a huge opportunity for us in the anti-trafficking field to improve the way that we support survivors in their journey. There's a few agencies I would love to just highlight briefly. One is Brian Kent. He is a civil attorney that has used civil restitution for justice for many survivors in a variety of fields. Right now, he's actually going after Pornhub. And so if you have survivors that part of their exploitive experience was on any type of porn website, which was most likely owned by the Pornhub's main people, please let us know. We would love for them to be a part of this. We'll connect you with Brian. He himself is a survivor of sexual trauma as well. His whole staff is trauma informed. We love partnering with him. So please let us know if you have a survivor that would like to be a part of that lawsuit. Additionally, a huge shout out to the Joseph Project. They provide free legal services to survivors all across the country. One of them in particular that I just thought was incredible was a survivor whose trafficker got out of prison, and when he got out of prison, a petition to have shared custody with their child. And so Joseph Project was able to come in and support her. Similarly, they've been able to help get either full vacatur for some charges or help them to reduce charges. They support them in a variety of ways. And we're seeing other agencies like Alight, based out of Colorado, come in and support in a legal capacity. So I think that there's opportunity here. I think that there's a growing awareness of the need, and we're excited to see where this leads.
Yep, so also just jumping back into our survey findings now, so we can go to the next slide, please. For the next part of question number 16, the organizations were surveyed to indicate whether or not they receive financial support or otherwise from the government, and they were also asked how adequately they believe the government supports their work. 56% of the organizations reported receiving financial support or otherwise from the government, while 44% reported receiving no form of support from the government, financial or otherwise. In terms of how adequately the government supports direct service organizations, the most common response to this question was 1, meaning the government does not support their organization, financial or otherwise. Out of the 70 organizations, 31% indicated a 1, and only 17% of the organizations chose a 5, which indicates that the government support is essential to their ability to function as an organization. These survey results really suggest that service providers within the anti-trafficking field may not be adequately funded by the government overall. And while further analysis is needed to really understand the reasoning for this lack of support, some possible explanations and factors might include the inability of agencies to meet government funding requirements, a lack of awareness about funding opportunities, limited organizational capacity to apply for these opportunities, or potentially concerns that funding will result in restrictions to program implementation or functions. So for the next question from the TIP office, it focused on whether or not survivors of both labor and sex trafficking, regardless of their various identities, receive the same quality and level of access to services. We at NTSA recognize that there are some intersecting and common service needs among both survivors of labor and sex trafficking. However, we really believe it's important to recognize that both the experiences and the recovery of these two types of survivors widely vary. Thus, we believe that this question should be reframed to assess how service needs for labor and sex trafficking survivors differ, and how identity, including things like citizenship, gender identity, and racial and ethnic identity, significantly impact the quality and level of access to services for both labor and sex trafficking survivors. So first, we defined how service needs for sex and labor trafficking survivors may differ based on their experience. So while there are often common vulnerabilities among both labor and sex trafficking survivors in the United States, including primarily being impoverished and thus vulnerable to predatory practices in individuals, there are fundamental differences in these populations of survivors and their recovery needs. For example, for survivors of labor trafficking, their vulnerabilities are commonly tied to their citizenship status, as individuals without legal status and work authorization are at an increased risk for being forced into illegal and underground work environments where abuse and manipulation can be utilized. So for these survivors, their service needs for recovery can largely center on these immigration needs, including having access to legal assistance to apply for a T visa and work authorization that will allow them to eventually find sustainable and legal employment. Additionally, survivors of labor trafficking may require long-term medical care to address the physical injuries and the disabilities that can result from being forced into harsh labor conditions, as well as they may need mental health services to address post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, various different mental health issues that are common for both labor and sex trafficking survivors. So now on the other side of things, survivors of sex trafficking that are undocumented immigrants likely will need similar legal assistance to undocumented labor trafficking survivors. However, there are other multifaceted service needs that most survivors of sex trafficking require in order to leave a cycle of dependency on their trafficker. Alongside essentials like shelter, food, and clothing, sex trafficking survivors need services including comprehensive case management, educational opportunities, job and or vocational training, legal assistance for charges related to their exploitation, medical and dental services to meet their unaddressed needs, and mental health services. So while all survivors of both labor and sex trafficking may require some or all of these common services, the magnitude of service needs largely depends on the circumstances of their trafficking and exploitation. And we have recognized amongst those that we have served that for sex trafficking survivors, often their exploitation and circumstances result in a complete lack and destruction of social, physical, and emotional support systems, which consequently requires their services to be multifaceted and comprehensive to address their many short-term and long-term needs. So next, to address the second part of this question, we wanted to assess how identity impacts the quality and level of access to services for survivors overall. So through our TIP report survey, we identified some core gaps in service options for marginalized identities among the organizations that we surveyed. Specifically, out of the 70 organizations that participated, only 23% served males, 19% served non-binary individuals, 16% served labor trafficking survivors, and 11% served transgender males. In contrast, as you can see from the overall demographics served by these 70 organizations, overwhelmingly sex trafficking female and adult survivors have access to services, with between 57 to 68 of the total 70 organizations serving these populations. Next most commonly served are the populations of persons of other ethnicities, with 42 of the organizations serving this clientele, and persons with disabilities, who are served by 31 of the organizations, while minors, transgender females, and non-US citizens are served by between 18 to 24 of the total 70 organizations. And now, on a larger scale, through NTSA's National Alliance referral system that helps survivors to be placed in residential programs, we have found that these service gaps for certain marginalized identities are consistent across the anti-trafficking field. For example, out of the over 200 organizations serving survivors within our ARS network, only around 85 organizations serve survivors over the age of 40. Only around 46 programs serve labor trafficking survivors. Only 23 programs serve transgender survivors. 21 serve minor survivors, and only 14 programs serve male survivors. These responses and gaps in our ARS network really suggest a deficit in available services for survivors who belong to marginalized populations and/or identities within the United States. And what's really critical to note here is that because research suggests that survivors of marginalized identities are less likely to identify and seek out services, accompanied by this gap in available services for them, there is really an unfortunate reality that those that might be most in need of comprehensive services and support are not receiving adequate help.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of give a highlight of some agencies that we think are being creative in how they respond to the deficit of services for some of these more marginalized demographics of survivors. One of them being Sail of Freedom down in Florida. They have multiple residential programs but serve female only, and realized that there was a huge need to be able to serve males as well. And so what their response is to partner with local halfway houses where the males can actually live there, but be completely embraced and absorbed into the programming of Sail of Freedom's overall services, so that they get stable housing and at the same time are able to get services that are directly catered towards survivors of trafficking. And we thought that was a really creative response to the need that we see across the country. Additionally, a huge shout out to Emmaus in Chicago. They've been serving the male and trans community for over 20 years. And they will say the same thing that we're going to say is, even the agencies that, yes, we have in our list 14 organizations that serve males, the vast majority of those are not doing it in a residential capacity. There is a huge lack of residential programs for the male population, and it's very, very needed. We have heard from partners like REST out in Seattle that there is a large group of male victims that are really resistant to identifying themselves as needing access to services, because there's this added shame. Like, they're already victimized through the trafficking experience, and then there's an added layer of shame in that our society says that men are supposed to be the protectors, and they can't protect the fellow female survivors. And so who are they to be able to ask for help when they weren't able to play their role as a male in American society? So it's multi-layered that we really need to acknowledge and be intentional of reaching out to this marginalized population.
Mm-hmm. And we applaud all of the organizations that are working to address this major gap. And we hope that as a community and as a field, we'll continue to address this gap with more residential programs and more programs overall to serve marginalized identities. So now we're going to jump back in and talk about the next part of our survey, which we sought to answer protection question number 17, which focuses on the quality of victim services, how to improve victim care, and assesses the ability of survivors to enter and leave a program at will, and also to seek employment while receiving assistance. So regarding the quality and status of victim services currently, we recognize a real shared belief among service providers within this field that it is essential to be survivor-centered and trauma-informed within service provision in order to provide real quality care. Amongst NTSA's 96 member organizations, trauma-informed care really remains to be one of the most popular and important conversations that we see within our community board posts, within our newsletters, and also within our conference presentations. We also recognize, however, that it is difficult to ensure quality care for survivors if there are no standards of care that are consistent across the field. So this is why NTSA created our essential standards of care, which provide guidelines for how to uplift and maintain quality and trauma-informed policies and practices within various categories, including governance, ethics compliance, risk management, safety, etc. So these essential standards are not only the foundation for general membership with the Alliance, but also they act as the cornerstone for NTSA's newly launched accreditation, as qualified trauma-informed residential programs across the country can be accredited upon meeting these essential standards. So through our essential standards, as well as our active growing network of service providers, we believe that the quality of survivor services is continually improving through knowledge sharing, and collaboration. So to answer the next part of question 17, we asked participants of the survey to indicate how victim services in the field at large could be improved from a list of common requests from NTSA members and partner organizations. So survey responses reflected that the most commonly regarded areas for improvement were needing emergency housing and trauma-informed training, as 77% of the programs indicated needing access to emergency/short-term housing, and 76% of the programs indicated needing training and certification on trauma-informed care. The next most commonly selected areas for improvement were needing steps for aftercare for survivors who graduate the program and needing training on de-escalation and conflict management. 7 of the organizations selected other, with one organization stating that victim services could be improved through, quote, more collaboration and partnerships between agencies. So as a network of service providers across the country, NTSA continues to prioritize increased collaboration and partnerships between the various anti-trafficking organizations and actors. Through our membership and knowledge center, we are really dedicated to ensuring that survivors are receiving the best possible care through the sharing of resources and knowledge to uplift best practices. And we really hope that as an anti-trafficking field continues to grow and develop, this focus on collaboration towards excellence will further become a cornerstone of our field overall. So next, survey respondents were also asked if benefits were linked to whether a victim assisted law enforcement or participated in a trial, or whether a trafficker was convicted. Out of the 70 organizations, 66% indicated no, that benefits were not linked to victims' cooperation with law enforcement, participation in a trial, or the conviction of traffickers, while 10% indicated yes, that benefits were linked to these factors. 18% indicated not applicable, and 6% indicated unknown. Additionally, the organizations were asked to answer questions regarding their policies and practices surrounding the ability of survivors to enter or leave their program at will. Overwhelmingly, the organizations reported that survivors choose independently whether or not to enter their program, and 94% of programs reported that survivors can choose independently to leave the program at will. These responses suggest that within the anti-trafficking field, survivors largely choose whether or not to enter and leave a program at their own will, with really the only exceptions being if the survivor is court-ordered or mandated to be in the program. Organizations were also asked about their policies and practices regarding whether survivors can leave the program unchaperoned and whether or not they can seek employment while receiving assistance. So 56% of the organizations indicated that adult survivors can leave their program premises unchaperoned. 16% indicated that adult survivors cannot leave their program premises unchaperoned. 6% indicated not applicable as their organization serves minors, and 23% indicated other. Among the other responses, several organizations indicated that survivors could not leave unchaperoned only for a certain period of time or during a certain phase of the program. For example, one organization stated survivors are, quote, chaperoned during the first year, unchaperoned during the second year. This also is true for some organizations regarding the ability of clients to pursue employment, with 14% of the organization selecting other and clarifying that employment ability depends on the phase that the client is currently in. However, the majority, 80% of the organizations, indicated that simply survivors can seek employment while receiving assistance in their program. So for the final section of our submission, we answered protection question number 18 regarding the status of collaboration and cooperation between service providers and law enforcement within the United States. So first, we asked our survey participants to indicate whether their organization and law enforcement work together cooperatively, for instance, to share information about trafficking trends overall or to plan services following a raid. Organizations were able to choose between the responses of always, sometimes, never, and not applicable, which means that they do not partner with law enforcement. Out of the 70 organizations, 61% indicated that they sometimes work with law enforcement, 23% indicated they always work with law enforcement, 13% indicated non applicable, and only 3% selected that they never work with law enforcement. So following this, organizations who do partner with law enforcement were asked to rate the level of cooperation, communication, and trust between their organization and law enforcement, with a rating of 1, meaning that there is minimal cooperation, communication, and trust, and a rating of 5, being that there is complete cooperation and trust. Only 15% of the organizations indicated 5, that there is complete cooperation, communication, and trust between their organization and law enforcement. 44% selected 4, and 31% selected 3. Out of the organizations who responded, no respondents indicated 1, meaning minimal cooperation between their program and law enforcement. So these findings suggest that there is moderate cooperation, communication, and trust between service providers and law enforcement at this current moment. While there is always room for improvement within these relationships so that collaboration is strengthened and therefore survivor screening, identification, and assistance is overall improved, the survey finding is encouraging as there is really already a recognizable and established cooperation and trust within this relationship between service providers and law enforcement. Additionally, organizations that do not partner with law enforcement were asked to explain their reasoning for the lack of partnership. So some common responses including that their program does not have the capacity to partner at this moment, that there is a distinction between how law enforcement approaches survivor protection and how service providers approach that, and that clients may not trust law enforcement enough to have that cooperation.
One of our partners that we love to work with is Dr. Gilmer, and he has been in the anti-trafficking field for a number of years, most recently working for Homeland Security down in Birmingham, Alabama. And he, I think, has really helped us to understand what a healthy dynamic between law enforcement and local service providers has looked like. He has really great partnerships. One of the things that he said at multiple webinars and twice at our conference is the number one way to have a healthy partnership with law enforcement is food. Food is a great incentive. I'm just teasing, but actually he has said that on multiple times. But one of the things that I do love about his explanation of healthy partnership is understanding that that law enforcement and service providers speak different languages, and that's okay, and that we need to stay in our lanes, not be frustrated that we're speaking different languages, but respect it. Do what you do best and respect what they do best, and then we can all really work very collaboratively, because whether you're using crass language or faith-filled language, everybody's motivation there is to ensure that survivors have the most positive experience as they are working to exit the life. And so let's go into these partnerships with optimism, with for lack of a better word, grace for each other, and really support each other in this partnership.
So that ultimately wraps up the 3 key sections regarding protection that NTSA addressed in our submission to the 2022 TIP report. To access and read our full submission, you can always go to our homepage of our website, shelteredalliance.org. And if you have any questions regarding our submission or this presentation, you can always contact me at my email, aarchard@shelteredalliance.org.
Yep, and Annie also is a part of the lead team for our accreditation program. So if you want more information on our essential standards, who's on our accreditation panel, when we say experts have partnered with us on this, who are those experts and why did they partner with us? Annie is happy to field all of those questions. It is so important for us to be intentional of offering the very best quality of care. Before this webinar, I was actually commenting to our staff, I think our new motto should be good intentions does not negate harmful practices. And so let's all work together to ensure that survivors are being offered the very, very best quality of care. And the number one way to do that is through collaboration. Those of us that have been in the field for a number of years knows that many of the lessons we've learned has been learned the hard way. And sadly, sometimes those hard lessons have been at the expense of survivors. So let's learn from each other. Let's collaborate. If you participated in this survey, I could not be more grateful because this really helps to enhance the understanding of what's happening across the country. So thank you, thank you, thank you for being here. If you have questions, please put them in the chat right now. We do have one, Annie, that I'll read to you, and it's Chris Lim. Shout out to Chris. Thank you for being here so much. Glad to have you. Do you know if there's any correlation between the benefits being linked to services and those that have government funding?
Yeah, so I think I can imagine the answer to that is yes, but that is just speculation because we did not assess that in our specific survey. The only protection question that related to that was whether or not benefits were linked to what the actual victim survivor is doing, such as participating in a trial or whether or not their trafficker was convicted. So we do not have information on that at the moment, but I would bet that the answer to that is yes, that benefits are linked to whether or not your organization has government funding, because obviously that comes with a lot more resources and connections when you have that funding overall.
Yeah, and just to expand on that, anecdotally, I will say that for many of the agencies that receive funding, such as VOCA funding, part of that budget is actually allocated to staff training. And many of us in this field know that staff turnover is a real hardship for agencies. Having consistency in staff for survivors is absolutely invaluable. So if we can train and equip our staff to offer the very best quality of care, it means less burnout for staff themselves, which means longevity for those staff. And so I think that that is one indicator that you would have better services for survivors because the staff are being able to be trained and equipped to serve survivors directly. So that's just kind of anecdotally my reflections on that. Yeah, thanks, Chris. That was a great question. Another question from John is, for the info on number of staff working on organizations, are those full-time?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So for that question, we did not specify, and the TIP office did not specify whether it had to be part-time or full-time. So the question was just staff overall. So obviously there might be some distinction there with part-time staff as well involved in those numbers. But that's definitely a good point and something that we at NTSA would be super interested in looking into when we're talking about the demographics of service provision, is what are the actual makeups of staff at the people that are providing on the ground support to survivors. So I do think that's something that we're interested in answering in the future, is seeing the difference between full-time, part-time, and even volunteers at these service providers.
Yeah, and Annie, I think that that's a really important point to note is many agencies have what we call full-time unpaid staff or volunteers. And these are volunteers that maybe they do weekend shifts at zero cost to the agency or overnight, or they come and teach classes regularly. We don't know if those unpaid volunteer staff were part of those numbers or not. Many agencies, those incredible volunteers are a huge backbone to the success of their program. So yeah, I think that there's a lot more to dive into. Another piece of employment that we're very curious about is how many of these agencies have clinical social workers on staff or other types of clinicians on staff versus kind of lay people that are learning as we go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, we have another question. Gosh, these are such great questions. I love them. Curious why addiction services such as detox coordination and inpatient services were not addressed, and if it will be added in the future. We could not agree more. We are right on the same page as you. One of the realities that we're seeing with our referral system, so through the 3.5 years that we've been facilitating our referral system, we've now been able to facilitate a little over 950 referrals. And because of that, we're seeing some trends. One of them that's a little bit challenging for us is an increase in referrals that are prescribed Suboxone or methadone. And it's problematic for us because very few agencies are equipped to take a referral that is on either one of those. And we see some others popping up as well, but those are the most prevalent at this point. Not only that, but I mean, all of you, I'm sure, are aware, it's really hard to have a referral that they have more than 30 days clean. And so that detox phase is really important and something that we as an anti-trafficking community really need to start addressing much more vigilantly. Annie, did you want to add anything else to that?
No, I think that's so important. For the reasoning as to why we didn't include the addiction services within our survey was simply that the TIP office, that was not a part of their question, which I think is a very important gap in information that needs to be filled. And I think that's another thing that we would be interested in looking at in terms of our ARS network, in terms of what are the actual availabilities for addiction services within service providers.
Yeah, we have seen some NTSA members, such as Red Rope. Oh goodness, if they're on this webinar, I know you're wonderful. They're in Tennessee. Red Rope Project, I think is what they're called. And they have formal partnerships with the local detox facilities so that when they get a referral that is in an active addiction status, they put them in that detox facility, they get clean, and then be a part of their program, because very few agencies have the funding or the capability of bringing someone currently in addiction into the program. And the stability is just really complicated, bringing them into a environment like that. So yeah, it's an important discussion to have. Chris asked, do you have the opportunity to compare the demographics of our referral requests with the gaps we found in services?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So for the purposes of this report, we only compared the actual gaps we saw in the ARS network with the gaps that we saw in the survey. And we found that they were very consistent with the fact that those marginalized identities are underserved overall. So in terms of our actual ARS requests, so when our referrals come in, we did not look at how many referrals, let's say, we get from males versus how many service providers actually provide for males. So that's another very important information gap that we can also try to fill in the future. But in terms of what we typically see, obviously the most common ARS requests do come from populations that are most commonly represented within survivors, including those most commonly served populations of sex trafficking survivors, females, and adult victims. So we do see that that is where the most service providers fit. And that's also where a lot of the referrals come in as well. But that just makes it more glaring when we see a referral for a marginalized identity come in and realize the fact that we might not have adequate care for them, and we might not be able to place them in a place that meets all of their needs because of that deficit in availability.
For sure. Yeah. And I'll just to kind of elaborate a little bit more on that. Some other gaps in services that we see through our referral system. One is mothers that want to keep custody of their children while being in a program. So mothers and children are very, very hard to place. Very few agencies are equipped to handle that. Minors, we all know this. That's not a surprise for anyone. Minor programs, we need to see an increase in those. And then other agencies that are equipped to handle more complex kind of mental health trauma. Yeah. Another question that we have is, in average, what are the types of education support provided? Yeah, that's a good question. And we didn't address that in the survey, but I will just say getting a GED is really a foundational piece that most agencies have had to learn how to offer. And we've seen creative ways to approach this, whether it's bringing in tutors. There's a lot of government assistance to support that, but certainly GEDs is important. We're also seeing an increase in educational opportunities in, I forgot the term, but it's more of like the hands-on, oh
Like
gosh,
vocational training.
vocational training. Yeah, vocational training. I think what's important when you're thinking about education is there's some really incredible organizations, and I'm just going to give a shout out, Free for Life. They're based out of Nashville, Tennessee, and they provide scholarships for survivors that want to continue their education. So there are, and they're explicitly for survivors of trafficking. They partner you with a mentor that's already been in the same field to help you go through that journey. I think they're doing a phenomenal job. So if you want to look more into that, certainly look them up. Free for Life. They're pretty great. Another one is for those that have the ear of government officials, we really struggle with finding appropriate trauma-informed, safe detox and inpatient SUD care that accepts Medicaid. This is a huge need and needs to be addressed. Yep, we are right on the same page. And what's interesting is maybe about, I think it's been 9 months now, we actually reworked our referral system to make it accessible on jot form, which means instead of having to fill out a PDF, which is very white collared, can be a little complicated, jot form is a little more accessible to the average person, including many survivors. So we saw a huge increase in self-referrals. And through that, we've seen a lot more complicated referral cases. For example, we had one where it was a mother who was a trafficking survivor. Her daughter, who was a minor, was also being trafficked. Their 2 dogs and 3 cats, and they all wanted to be together. So that one was really, really tricky. But yes, we're seeing a huge need, especially when they are in active addiction, to find placement. So yeah. And then we were asked, what about culturally specific safe houses? Yeah, I think that this one is really important. It's interesting that you asked that, because we actually don't even ask that on, we do ask ethnicity on our referrals. And if you have a language barrier, it is problematic, because as you saw in our survey results, very few agencies have the ability to offer alternative languages besides English. Annie, I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, no, we did see that in the survey, the fact that language interpretation or language classes is one of the lowest commonly provided services. But we also noticed the fact that this can be one of the most important services for those that obviously are of a different culture, different ethnicity, have that language barrier. In order to get the other services, they need to have that gateway of having language interpretation. So that is definitely a huge deficit, and something that we hope will be improved in the field overall, so that those specific survivors will have access to providers that are going to address all of their needs and address it in a way that is culturally competent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that that's so important to understand cultural nuances in serving different survivors. When you take for example, survivors that are from from an Asian background, there's this level of pressure. Most of them were trafficked here with the impression that they were actually going to be able to send money back to the family. And so when they get out of the life, that piece of needing to make income, so they're providing for their entire families, I mean, like multiple generations overseas, is very, very strong. And so that has to be incorporated into the services you're providing, because the pressure is so strong. So yeah, I think that's a really important question to address. The last question we have so far is, what type of employment support is available for illegal survivors?
Yep. So we did not specifically address this in our survey, but this is just something that NTSA is interested in, I'm personally interested in. So I've done some research on this, in the fact that there is a deficit of available employment and overall economic empowerment solutions for survivors that are undocumented. And unfortunately, that's just a reality. And so there has to be solutions that obviously include legal assistance twofold with employment support, so that while they are pursuing educational placement or job placement, they are also being helped by legal lawyers that are going to be able to get them their T visa and work authorization, so that they can ultimately have legal employment and will not be forced into underground markets where trafficking, as we know, is very common. So we do know that there needs to be an increase of employment support, and we obviously recommend that service providers, whenever possible, while they provide essentials like food, shelter, mental health care, also, if possible, include employment support and services when possible, because we do see holistically that is a very important part of recovery, and also getting towards long-term recovery and stability overall.
Yeah, and I would even say this is highly important for domestic survivors as well. One program that I think does a really creative approach to this is Worthwhile Wear. They're outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Shout out to Dan if you're here. Part of the journey of graduating from their program is that their graduates have $10,000 in savings, so they have that cushion, and they have employment secured that comes with benefits. And I love that, because that is a very, like, I call us the square people. Like, that's a very square America concept, finding a job with benefits. And what a great way to help survivors not feel like they are on the side of society, but are actually embraced into everyday America. So I just think that's really an important piece of it. The other part of employment that I think is really important for service providers to be a part of is understanding kind of one reality check of how much you make for a livable wage. You know, we all know survivors, when they're in the life, have a very high quota. I don't make $500 to $1,000 a day. Did I just out my salary? Hi guys, I work for a nonprofit. I don't make that much money. Many people don't. And that's a huge reality check for survivors. I was with some when they got their very first square paycheck and were outraged that FICA, whoever that would be, was stealing their money from their paycheck. And I had to walk them through the understanding that that was actually government taxes. And they're like, come again? And I was like, welcome to the square world, people. Welcome to the square world. So it's important to be in a safe place as you start moving into that regular working environment. Yeah, FICA. Oh man, it's tricky. It's tricky. Yeah. All right, guys. Trisha, we are outraged too, darn it. Yeah. Trisha says she's outraged that FICA do steal so much. It's amazing. Yeah, I know. All of us service providers, if you've been there with the survivor the first time she gets her paycheck, yeah, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. Yeah, it was a big deal for me too. I was like 19 looking at my paycheck thinking, what's happening? So yeah, doing that in a safe place is a really great thing. Yeah. All right, guys, we are concluding now. And I just want to say again, thank you for being here. I hope this was enlightening to you. Please find our report on our website. Feel free to use it. Use it to figure out, if you're expanding your services, what are the greatest gaps? Because, and let me just, can I give a commercial for NTSA? If you're offering all of these services or any of these services, please let us know so we can update our database and send you those referrals, because we can't keep track of what everybody's offering as much as we want to. So hearing from you really helps us to ensure our referral network is as up to date as possible. So yeah, if you're still here with us, then I do want to give a shout out to Zach. If you haven't met him yet, he's our new membership coordinator. If you are a member of NTSA, you should know him and you should meet with him. He is an absolute delight. His laugh is infectious and he's got a nervous laugh, so he laughs a lot and I absolutely love it. Look at Mark. Zach is the best. Yes, he is, Mark. So we're glad to have Zach. And if you are not a member of NTSA, we would love for you to join the community. We really work so hard to collaborate, support each other, and build a community where we learn from each other. So, Chris, you're the best. I need to come out to Birmingham and give you a high five. All right, guys, we're going to end it here before I ramble on too much. Thank you guys for being here, and we'll see you soon, hopefully.